I'm not sure what happened. My iPad turned off right in the middle of that story. So, continued. Here's where we left off. Remember, those hats were coming off. Flop, flop, flop. And the guard had just said, "His Majesty waits in the throne room," said a guard, saluting the captain. The throne room. The captain dropped Bartholomew to the ground. "I'd certainly hate to be in your shoes," he said, shaking his head sadly. For a moment Bartholomew was terribly frightened. Still, he thought to himself, the king can do nothing dreadful to punish me because I haven't really done anything wrong. It would be cowardly to feel afraid. Bartholomew threw back his shoulders and marched straight ahead into the palace. "Follow the black carpet," said the guard at the door. All through the long hallway Bartholomew could hear muttering of voices behind heavy doors. "He won't take off his hat. No, he won't take off his hat. He won't take off his hat." Bartholomew walked on until he stood in the very middle of the throne room. Ooh, that king looks kind of mean. Very middle of the throne room. The king, in a long scarlet robe, was sitting on his throne. Beside him stood Sir Alaric, keeper of the king's records. He wore his belt, instead of a sword, a long silver ruler. Lords and noblemen of the court stood solemn and silent. The king looked down at Bartholomew severely. "Young man, I'll give you one more chance. Will you take off your hat for the king?" "Your Majesty," said Bartholomew, as politely as he possibly could, "I will, but I'm afraid it won't do any good." And he took off his hat, and it didn't do any good. Another hat sat on Bartholomew's head. He took off hat after hat after hat after hat, until he was standing in the middle of a great pile of hats. The lords and noblemen were so astonished they couldn't even speak. Such a thing had never happened in the throne room before. Here's where he walked in. "Heavens!" said Sir Alaric, keeper of the records, blinking behind his triangular spectacles. "He's taken off 45. And there were 3 more down in the town," said the king. "And you must add the 87 to that blew off my head when we galloped up the hill," said Bartholomew, trying to be helpful. 135 hats. Most unusual," said Sir Alaric, writing it down on a long scroll. "Come, come," said the king impatiently. "Sir Alaric, what do you make of all this nonsense?" "Very serious nonsense, your Majesty," answered Sir Alaric. "I advise you to call in the experts on this." "Excellent," agreed the king. "Ho, guard! Fetch Sir Snips, maker of hats for all the fine lords." Into the throne room marched the smallest man, wearing the tallest hat Bartholomew had ever seen. It was Sir Snips. It's hard to say. Instead of a sword, he wore at his side a large pair of scissors. So Sir Alaric has a ruler instead of a sword, and Sir Snips has scissors instead of a sword. "Take a look at the boy's hat," commanded the king. Sir Snips looked at Bartholomew Cubbon's hat and sniffed in disgust, and then he turned to the king and bowed stiffly. "Your Majesty, I, Sir Snips, am the maker of hats for all the fine lords. I make hats of cloth, of gold, fine silks, and gems, and ostrich plumes. You ask me what I think of this hat? Pooh! It's the most ordinary hat I have ever set eyes on." "In that case," said the king, "it should be very simple for you to take it off." "Simple indeed," mumbled Sir Snips haughtily, and standing on his tiptoes, he pushed his pudgy thumb at Bartholomew's hat and knocked it to the floor. And immediately another hat appeared on Bartholomew's head. Screebies! Screamed Sir Snips, leaping higher into the air than he was tall. And then he turned and ran, shrieking, out of the throne room. Ooh. Let's find out who that is. Dear me, said the king, looking very puzzled. If Snips can't do it, this must be more than an ordinary hat. 136, wrote Sir Alaric, wrinkling his brow. Your Majesty, I advise that you call in your wise men. A fine idea, said the king. Ho, guard, bring me Nad. Nad knows about everything in all of my kingdom. In came an old man. He looked at the hat on Bartholomew's head, and he looked at the pile of hats on the floor. Nad, my wise man, can you take off his hat? Nad shook his head solemnly. No. Then fetch me father of Nad, commanded the king. He knows all about everything in all my kingdom and in all the world beyond. In came an even older man. But when he looked at Bartholomew's hats, the father of Nad merely locked his fingers across his beard and said nothing. There's Nad, and there's father of Nad. Then bring me the father of Nad, ordered the king. He knows about everything in my kingdom, in all the world beyond, and in all the worlds there might happen to be. Then came the oldest man of them all, but he just looked at Bartholomew and nibbled nervously on the end of his beard. Does this mean there is no one in my whole kingdom who can take off this boy's hat? Bellowed the king in a terrifying voice. A small voice came up through the balcony window. What's the matter, Uncle Derwin? To Bartholomew it sounded like the voice of a boy. The king stepped out on the balcony and leaned over the marble railing. There's a boy in here just about your age, the king said. He won't take off his hat. Bartholomew tiptoed up behind the king and looked down. There stood a boy with a big lace collar, a very proud little boy with his nose in the air. It was the Grand Duke Wilfred, nephew of the king. You send him down here, said Grand Duke Wilfred. I'll fix him. The king thought for a minute. He pushed back his crown and scratched his head. Well, maybe you can. There's no harm in trying. Take him to the Grand Duke Wilfred, commanded the king, and two of the king's own guards led Bartholomew out of the throne room. Pooh, said the Grand Duke Wilfred, looking at Bartholomew's hat and laughing meanly. That hat won't come off? You stand over there. He pointed to a corner where the wall curved out. I need a little target practice with my bow and arrow. When Bartholomew saw that the Grand Duke Wilfred had only a child's bow, he didn't feel frightened. He spoke up proudly. I can shoot with my father's big bow. My bow's plenty big enough for shooting hats, especially hats like yours, answered Wilfred, and he let fly an arrow. Zzz! It grazed Bartholomew's forehead and nipped off his hat. Away it blew and away over the parapet. Here he is. He's getting ready. See what happened? But and he let fly an arrow. Zzz, and another hat appeared. Zzz, and another. Zzz, zzz, zzz. He let the arrows fly till the Grand Duke's whole bag full of arrows was gone. And still a hat sat upon Bartholomew's head. It's not fair, cried the Grand Duke. It's not fair. He threw down his bow and stamped on it. 154 hats, gulped Sir Alaric. These hats are driving me mad, the king's voice rang out through all the palace. Why waste time with a child's bow and arrow? Fetch me the mightiest bow and arrow in all my realm. Fetch me the yeoman of the bowmen. Yeoman of the bowmen, echoed all the lords and noblemen of the court. There he is, the yeoman of the bowmen. A gigantic man strode out across the terrace. His bow was as big as a branch of a tree, and his arrow was as thick and long as Bartholomew and thicker than his wrist. Yeoman of the bowmen, said the king, shoot off this boy's hat and make it stay off. Bartholomew was trembling so hard he could scarcely stand straight. The yeoman bent back his mighty bow. Zip! Like a mad giant hornet, the arrow tore through the air toward Bartholomew Cubbins. Zap! The sharp arrow bit through his hat and carried it off and on for a full mile until it stuck into a tree. Yet there was still on Bartholomew's head another hat. The face of the yeoman of the bowmen went white as the palace walls. It's black magic, he shrieked. Black magic, that's just what it is, sighed the king with relief. I should have thought of that before. That makes things simple. Back to the throne room. Call my magicians. In the whole throne room there wasn't a sound as loud as a breath, but from the spiral stairs that led down from the southwest tower came the shuffling of slow, padded feet. The magicians were coming. Low and slow they were chanting words that were strange. Dig a hole 5 furlongs deep, down to where the night snakes creep. Mix and mold the mystic mud, Malber, Malber, Tidder, Tud. In came 7 black-gowned magicians, and beside each one stalked a lean black cat. They circled around Bartholomew Cubbins, muttering deep and mysterious sounds. Stop this useless muttering, ordered the king. I want a chant that will charm away this boy's hat. The magicians huddled over Bartholomew and chanted, Winkabus, Tinkabus, Fottachi clay, hat on this demon's head, fly far away. Howl, men, howl away, howl away, howl away. Yowl, cats, yowl away, yowl away, yowl away. Hat on this demon's head, sweep away, creep away, leap away, gleep away, and never come back. Mighty good chant, said the king, looking very pleased. Are you sure it will work? All the magicians nodded together. But, said the king, looking puzzled, there still seems to be a hat upon his head. How long will it take the charm to work? Be calm, O sire, and have no fears, chanted the magicians. Our charm will work in 10 short years. 10 years, gasped the king. Away, fools, he shouted. Out of my sight. I can't wait 10 years to get rid of this hat. Oh dear, what can I do? What can I do? If I were king, whispered the Grand Duke Wilfred, I'd chop off his head. A dreadful thought, said the king, biting his lip. But I'm afraid I will have to. Young man, he said to Bartholomew Cubbins, and he pointed to a small door at the end of the room. March down those steps to the dungeon and tell the executioner to chop off your head. Bartholomew's heart sank into his boots, but he did as the king commanded. I must take off my head, he said, my hat. I must take off my hat, he said to himself, as he started down the long black stairway. This is my last chance. One hat after another he tore from his head. There's the Grand Duke Wilfred telling the king he should chop off his head. 156, 157, 158. It grew colder and damper. 231, 232, 233. It seemed Bartholomew. He must be in the very heart of the mountain. "Who's there?" said a voice from the blackness. Bartholomew turned the corner and stepped into the dungeon. The executioner was whistling and swinging his axe idly because at the moment he had nothing to do. In spite of his business, he really seemed to be a very pleasant man. "The king says you must chop off my head," said Bartholomew. "Oh, I'd hate to," said the executioner, looking at him with a friendly smile. "You seem like such a nice boy." "Well, the king says you have to," said Bartholomew, "so please get it over with." "All right," sighed the executioner, "but first you have got to take off your hat." "Why?" asked Bartholomew. "I don't know," said the executioner, "but it's one of the rules. I can't execute anyone with his hat on." "All right," said Bartholomew, "you take it off for me." The executioner leaned across the chopping block and flipped off Bartholomew's hat. "What's this?" he gasped, blinking through the holes in his mask. As another hat sat on Bartholomew's head, he flipped off this one, and then another, and then another, and then another. "Fiddlesticks!" grunted the executioner, throwing his axe on the floor. "I can't execute you at all." And he shook hands with Bartholomew and sent him back upstairs to the king. The king had been taking a nap on the throne. "What are you doing back here?" he said to Bartholomew, angry at being awakened. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," explained Bartholomew. "My head can't come off with my hat on. It's against the rules." "So it can't," said the king, leaning back wearily. "Now, how many hats does that make altogether?" "The executioner knocked off 13, and I left 178 more on the dungeon steps," answered Bartholomew. 346 hats, mumbled Sir Alaric from behind his scroll. "Uncle Derwin," yawned the Grand Duke Wilfred. "I suppose I'll have to do away with him. Send him up to the highest turret, and I, in person, will push him off." "Wilfred, I'm surprised at you," said the king, "but I guess it's a good idea." So the king and the Grand Duke led Bartholomew Cubbins toward the highest turret. Up and up the turret stairs he climbed, and behind them. Up and up the turret stairs he climbed behind them. "This is my last chance, my very last chance," thought Bartholomew. He snatched off his hat. 347. He snatched another one. His arms were aching from pulling off all the hats, but still the hats came. Bartholomew climbed on. 448, 449, 450, counted Sir Alaric, puffing up the stairs behind him. Do you see what's happening? Now there are 2 feathers, 3 feathers. Wait a minute. Suddenly Sir Alaric stopped. He looked. He took off his triangular spectacles and wiped them on his sleeve. And then he looked again. The hats began to change. Hat 451 had not 1 but 2 feathers. Hat 452 had 3, and hat 453 also had 3 and a little red jewel. Each new hat was fancier than the last one before it. Your Majesty, cried out Sir Alaric. But the king and the Grand Duke were way up where they couldn't hear, and they'd already reached the top of the highest turret. Bartholomew was following just behind. Step right out here and get up on that wall, snapped Grand Duke Wilfred. I can't wait to push you off. But first, let's look at these hats. There's the one with the jewel. When Bartholomew reached the top of the stairs, this is the hat that was on his head. He was wearing the most beautiful hat that had ever been seen in the kingdom of Did. It had a ruby larger than any the king himself had ever owned. It had ostrich plumes and cockatoo plumes and mockingbird plumes and paradise plumes. Besides such a hat, even the king's crown seemed like nothing. The Grand Duke Wilfred took a quick step forward. Bartholomew thought his end had come at last. "Wait!" shouted the king. He could not take his eyes off the magnificent hat. "I won't wait," the Grand Duke talked back to the king. "I'm going to push him off now, and the big new hat makes me madder than ever." And he flung out his arms to push Bartholomew off. But the king was quicker than Wilfred. He grabbed him by the back of his fine lace collar. "This is to teach you," His Majesty said sternly, "that Grand Dukes never talk back to their king." And he turned the Grand Duke Wilfred over his knee and spanked him soundly right on the seat of his royal pants. That was right after this. "And now," smiled the king, lifting Bartholomew down from the wall, "it would be nice if you'd sell me that wonderful hat." 498, 499, broke in the tired voice of Sir Alaric, who had just arrived at the top of the steps. "And that," he pointed to the hat on Bartholomew's head, "makes exactly 500. 500, exclaimed the king. "Will you sell it for 500 pieces of gold?" "Anything you say, sire," answered Bartholomew. "You see, I've never sold one before." The king's hands trembled with joy as he reached for the hat. Slowly, slowly, Bartholomew felt the weight of a great hat lifted from his head. He held his breath, and suddenly he felt the cool evening breezes blow through his hair. His face broke into a happy smile. The head of Bartholomew Cubbins was bare. "Look, Your Majesty, look," he shouted to the king. "No, you look at me," answered the king, and he put the great hat on right over his crown. Arm in arm, the king and Bartholomew went down to the counting room to count out the gold. Then the king sent Bartholomew home to his parents, no basket on his arm, no hat on his head, but with 500 pieces of gold in a bag. And the king commanded that the hat he had bought, and all the other hats too, be kept forever in a great crystal case by the side of his throne. But neither Bartholomew Cubbins nor King Derwin himself nor anyone else in the kingdom of Did could ever explain how the strange thing had happened. They could only say it just happened to happen, and was not very likely to happen again. The end. 500 pieces of gold, 500 hats. Love this book. Hope you liked it too.